The morning mist hung heavy over Windsor Castle as Thomas Harrison adjusted his red ceremonial uniform one last time. He had served the royal family for 15 years, and today felt different from any other day in his long career. The weight of his responsibility pressed down on his shoulders like never before. Thomas stood at attention outside the Queen's former private quarters, where the late Queen Elizabeth II had spent her final peaceful months. The silence in these halls felt sacred now, filled with memories of a woman who had dedicated her entire life to serving her people. Every morning for the past decade, Thomas had watched Her Majesty walk these very corridors with her beloved corgis trotting faithfully beside her. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the marble hallway. Queen Camilla appeared. Dressed in a dark navy suit, her expression stern and businesslike. Behind her walked two palace staff members, and Thomas noticed they carried what appeared to be pet carriers and leashes. "Good morning, Thomas," Camilla said, her voice carrying the authority of her new position. "I trust you received the instructions about the corgis?" Thomas felt his heart sink. He had indeed received the memo the previous evening, but he had hoped it was some kind of misunderstanding. The document stated that the late Queen's remaining corgis were to be relocated to appropriate facilities as part of the palace's reorganization efforts. "Yes, Your Majesty," Thomas replied, his voice steady despite the turmoil brewing inside him. "But if I may ask, what exactly does appropriate facilities mean?" Camilla's eyes narrowed slightly. "The dogs will be going to a countryside boarding facility where they can live out their remaining years in comfort. The palace is no longer suitable for pets, given our increased official duties and state functions." Thomas knew the corgis well. There were three left: Mook, Sandy, and Candy. Mook and Sandy had been gifts to the Queen during her final years, while Candy had been her companion for over a decade. These weren't just pets. They had been the Queen's dearest friends, her constant companions through joy and sorrow. "Your Majesty," Thomas began carefully. "Her late Majesty specifically mentioned in her personal wishes that the corgis should remain at the palace. They know no other home." Camilla's expression hardened. "Thomas, I appreciate your dedication to the previous arrangements, but times have changed. We must modernize the monarchy, and that includes making difficult decisions about maintaining animals in what is essentially a working government building." The staff members behind Camilla shifted uncomfortably. Thomas recognized them: Sarah, who had helped care for the corgis for years, and Marcus, a junior aide who looked particularly distressed by the situation. "The corgis have never been just animals to this family," Thomas said, his voice growing stronger. "They were part of Her Majesty's daily routine, her comfort, her joy. She would take them for walks every morning, feed them personally, and they slept in her private chambers." "That was then," Camilla replied curtly. "I have different preferences and different needs. The palace must reflect the new monarch's vision, not cling to old habits." Thomas felt a deep anger rising in his chest, but his training kept his expression neutral. He had sworn an oath to serve the crown, but he had also made a personal promise to the late Queen during her final weeks. She had looked at him with tired but determined eyes and whispered, "Take care of my babies, Thomas. They'll have no one else." The first corgi appeared around the corner, led by Sarah on a leash. It was Candy, the oldest of the three, her golden coat now touched with white around her muzzle. The dog immediately sensed something was wrong and began whimpering, pulling back toward the Queen's former chambers. "Please, Your Majesty," Thomas tried once more. "Could we perhaps arrange for them to stay in the staff quarters? I would personally take responsibility for their care. They wouldn't interfere with any official functions." "The decision has been made," Camilla said firmly. "Sarah, please bring the other two dogs. We need to complete this transfer today." As Sarah reluctantly led Candy toward one of the carriers, the corgi suddenly broke free and ran straight to Thomas. The loyal guard knelt down, and Candy jumped into his arms, trembling. The dog looked up at him with those intelligent brown eyes that seemed to plead for understanding. "She knows," Thomas whispered, more to himself than anyone else. "She knows what's happening." Muke and Sandy were brought out next, both equally distressed. These dogs had never known life outside the palace walls. The boarding facility, no matter how comfortable, would be like exile for creatures who had lived like royalty their entire lives. "Thomas, step away from the animal," Camilla commanded. "You're making this more difficult than necessary." But Thomas remained kneeling, holding Candy close. In that moment, he thought about all the mornings he had watched the Queen's face light up when her corgis greeted her. He remembered how she would speak to them in a gentle voice, telling them about her day, sharing her worries and joys with these loyal companions who listened without judgment. "Your Majesty," Thomas said, looking up at Camilla, "I cannot in good conscience allow this to happen." The hallway fell silent. The staff members stopped moving, Sarah still holding Muke's leash, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. "I beg your pardon?" Camilla's voice was dangerously quiet. Thomas stood slowly, still holding Candy. "I served Her late Majesty for 15 years. In all that time, I never once saw her as happy as when she was with these dogs. They weren't just pets to her. They were family. And I made her a promise." "You made a promise to whom?" Camilla demanded. "To Queen Elizabeth," Thomas said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "During her final weeks, when she was weak and worried about what would happen after she was gone, she asked me to look after her corgis. She said they would have no one else to speak for them." Camilla took a step closer to Thomas. "You forget yourself, guardsman. You serve the crown, and I am the crown now. Your loyalty should be to me, not to the dead." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. The callousness of referring to the beloved late queen as the dead sparked something inside him that had been building for weeks. Since the queen's passing, he had watched as traditions were discarded, staff members dismissed, and cherished customs abandoned in the name of modernization. "My loyalty is to the crown," Thomas replied, his military training evident in his straight posture and clear voice. "But the crown represents continuity, tradition, and honor. What you're proposing goes against everything Her late Majesty stood for." The other corgis had now gathered around Thomas's legs, as if sensing he was their protector. Sandy, the youngest, looked up at him with complete trust, while Muke pressed against his knee for comfort. "These animals have done nothing wrong," Thomas continued. "They loved their mistress unconditionally, brought her joy during difficult times, and now they're being cast aside like unwanted furniture. Where is the honor in that?" Camilla's face flushed with anger. "How dare you lecture me about honor? I am trying to move this monarchy forward, not remain trapped in the past. Those dogs are a symbol of old ways that no longer serve our purposes." "They're not symbols," Thomas said firmly. "They're living beings who grieve just like we do. Candy hasn't eaten properly since the Queen died. Muke still searches for her every morning. Sandy cries at night. They don't understand why their world has been turned upside down, and now you want to send them away to die among strangers." Sarah, who had been quietly listening, finally spoke up. "Your Majesty, if I may, Thomas is right about their grief. They've been struggling terribly. Perhaps we could find a compromise?" Camilla whirled around to face Sarah. "You forget your place as well. This is not a democracy. I have made my decision, and it will be carried out." But Thomas had made his decision too. Gently setting Candy down, he stepped forward and positioned himself between Camilla and the corgis. "I cannot allow this to happen." "You cannot allow?" Camilla's voice rose. "You're a guardsman. You follow orders." "I follow lawful orders that align with the honor and dignity of the crown," Thomas replied. "Sending these innocent animals away to die of broken hearts in a strange place is neither lawful nor honorable." The tension in the hallway was now electric. Other staff members had begun to gather at a respectful distance, drawn by the raised voices. Word was spreading quickly through the palace that something unprecedented was happening. "Thomas Harrison," Camilla said, her voice now ice-cold, "you are relieved of duty, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the premises, and you will never set foot in any royal residence again." Thomas felt the weight of his 15 years of service, his unblemished record, his dedication to the royal family, all crashing down around him. But when he looked at the 3 corgis huddled near his feet, still looking to him for protection, he knew he had made the right choice. "So be it," he said quietly, "but these dogs are not going anywhere." The standoff had begun, and Thomas Harrison, a simple guardsman who had never asked for anything more than to serve with honor, had just defied the Queen of England. The consequences would be swift and severe, but in his heart he knew that somewhere in the great beyond, Queen Elizabeth II was watching, and she was proud of her faithful guard who had kept his promise to protect her most beloved companions. As palace security was called, and the situation escalated beyond anyone's control, Thomas remained standing with the corgis, a lone figure in red uniform, making his final stand for loyalty, love, and the memory of a queen who had shown him what true service really meant. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the marble corridors of Windsor Castle as palace security approached the tense scene. Thomas Harrison stood his ground, the 3 corgis pressed close to his legs, their brown eyes filled with confusion and fear. What had started as a simple morning duty had transformed into the most important moment of his 15-year career. Chief of Security James Morrison arrived first, his face grave as he took in the situation. Behind him came 3 additional security officers, all of whom knew Thomas well. They had worked together for years, shared meals in the staff quarters, and celebrated each other's promotions and family milestones. "Thomas?" James said carefully, his voice low and measured. "I need you to step aside." Thomas looked at his longtime colleague and saw the conflict in his eyes. James had also served under Queen Elizabeth, and he understood the depth of devotion that the late queen had inspired in her staff. But duty was duty, and orders were orders. "I can't do that, James," Thomas replied, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "You know what these dogs meant to Her Majesty. You've seen her with them every day for years." Queen Camilla stepped forward, her patience clearly exhausted. "Mr. Morrison, I gave you clear instructions. Remove this man from the premises immediately." But something unexpected happened. As the security team moved closer, other palace staff began to appear in the hallway. First came Mrs. Elizabeth Davies, the head housekeeper who had served the royal family for over 20 years. Her usually perfect composure was cracking as she watched the scene unfold. "Your Majesty," Mrs. Davies said, her voice trembling slightly, "perhaps we could discuss alternative arrangements for the corgis?" Camilla turned sharply toward the housekeeper. "Mrs. Davies, you would do well to remember your position. This matter has been decided." But Mrs. Davies had seen enough. She had watched Queen Elizabeth's face light up every morning when the corgis bounded into her chambers. She had witnessed the late queen's final weeks, how the presence of her beloved dogs had brought comfort during her darkest hours. "With respect, Your Majesty," Mrs. Davies continued, "Queen Elizabeth specifically mentioned these dogs in her private wishes. She wanted them to remain at the palace in the care of people who loved them." More staff members began to gather. There was Peter, the gardener who had spent countless hours maintaining the special play area the Queen had created for the corgis in the castle grounds. Margaret, the kitchen assistant who had personally prepared the dogs' meals according to the Queen's exact specifications. Robert, the maintenance supervisor who had installed special dog doors and created comfortable sleeping areas in the Queen's chambers. Thomas felt a surge of emotion as he realized he wasn't alone in his stand. These people had all witnessed the bond between the Queen and her corgis. They had all, in their own ways, been part of the extended family that had surrounded these precious animals. "This is mutiny," Camilla declared, her voice rising. "I will not tolerate this behavior from palace staff." Young Sarah, still holding Muke's leash, suddenly spoke up. "Your Majesty, I've been caring for these dogs for 3 years. They're not just animals. They're family. The Queen treated them like her children." "The Queen is dead," Camilla snapped, her words causing visible flinches throughout the gathered staff. "I am Queen now, and these sentimental attachments must end." The cruelty of her words seemed to galvanize the group. Thomas felt Candy nuzzle against his leg and looked down to see the eldest corgi gazing up at him with complete trust. In that moment, he made a decision that would change everything. "Your Majesty," Thomas said, his voice carrying across the hallway with military precision, "I formally request permission to adopt the corgis myself." The suggestion caught everyone off guard. Camilla's eyes widened in surprise, while the other staff members exchanged hopeful glances. "Absolutely not," Camilla replied immediately. "You're being dismissed from service. You have no standing to make such a request." "Then I withdraw my request," Thomas said, "and I make it as a private citizen of the United Kingdom. These dogs need homes, and I'm offering them one." James Morrison stepped forward, clearly uncomfortable with his position. "Thomas, you need to comply with the Queen's orders. This situation is getting out of hand." But Thomas had spent too many years watching Queen Elizabeth's morning routine to give up now. He remembered how she would sit in her favorite chair, a corgi on each side, reading the morning papers while the dogs dozed contentedly in the sunshine streaming through the tall windows. He remembered her gentle voice telling them stories, sharing her concerns about the Commonwealth, and explaining why certain state functions were important. "Do you remember," Thomas said, addressing not just James but all the security officers, "how Her Majesty used to bring the corgis to the staff Christmas party? She said they were part of the palace family, and family takes care of each other." The memory hit home. Even the newest security officer remembered that tradition. Queen Elizabeth had insisted that the corgis participate in palace celebrations, dressing them in festive bandanas and allowing staff members to give them special treats. Camilla sensed the mood shifting against her and decided to escalate the situation. "Mr. Morrison, if you cannot control your men, I will find someone who can. Remove everyone from this hallway immediately." But Mrs. Davies stepped forward again, and this time her voice was stronger. "Your Majesty, with the greatest respect, the staff of this palace have served the crown faithfully for decades. We've never asked for anything except the privilege of serving. Now, we're asking for one thing: mercy for 3 innocent animals who loved our Queen and brought her happiness." The housekeeper's words seemed to break down the last barriers of restraint among the staff. Stories began pouring out, shared memories of the Queen and her beloved corgis that painted a picture of love and devotion that spanned decades. Peter spoke up about how the Queen would bring the corgis to visit the gardens, how she would laugh as they chased squirrels and rolled in the flower beds. Margaret shared how the Queen would personally prepare special birthday treats for each dog, complete with candles and celebration. Robert mentioned how the Queen had insisted on having heating installed in the dogs' sleeping areas, ensuring they would always be comfortable. As each story was shared, it became clear that these corgis weren't just pets. They were living symbols of the Queen's humanity, her capacity for love, and her understanding that even monarchs needed the unconditional affection that only animals could provide. Thomas watched Camilla's face as the stories unfolded, and he saw something troubling. Rather than being moved by these testimonies to the Queen's character, she seemed increasingly annoyed by them. It was as if the staff's devotion to Queen Elizabeth's memory was somehow threatening to her own authority. "Enough," Camilla finally declared. "I've heard quite enough sentiment for one morning. These animals are going to the facility as planned, and anyone who interferes will be immediately terminated." The threat hung heavy in the air. These people had devoted their lives to royal service. For many, it was all they had ever known. The prospect of losing their positions, their homes, and their purpose was terrifying. But Thomas looked around at the faces of his colleagues and saw something that gave him hope. Fear was there, yes, but it was mixed with determination. These people had served a queen who taught them that some things were more important than personal comfort or security. "Your Majesty," Thomas said, straightening to his full height. "I understand the consequences of my actions, but I also understand that serving the crown means upholding the values and traditions that make the monarchy worthy of respect. These dogs represent continuity, loyalty, and love, values that the British people expect from their royal family." Camilla's face flushed red with anger. "How dare you lecture me about what the British people expect? You're nothing but a guard." "Yes," Thomas replied, "I am a guard. I've spent my entire adult life guarding things that matter, and today, I'm guarding these 3 innocent animals who gave nothing but love to a woman who dedicated her life to service." The standoff intensified as more palace staff continued to arrive, drawn by word of the confrontation. Kitchen workers, cleaners, gardeners, and administrative assistants all began to gather, forming an unexpected but powerful show of solidarity. Camilla looked around at the growing crowd and realized she was facing something unprecedented, a palace-wide rebellion over 3 small dogs. But rather than backing down, she seemed to harden her position even further. "Very well," she said coldly. "Anyone who remains in this hallway after I count to 10 will be dismissed immediately. Security will forcibly remove the animals, and charges will be filed against anyone who resists." The countdown began, and Thomas felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Around him, some staff members began to step back, their faces filled with anguish, but their practical fears overcoming their emotional convictions. He didn't blame them. They had families to feed, mortgages to pay, futures to protect, but others remained. Mrs. Davies stood firm, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Sarah stayed close to Muke, tears streaming down her face. A handful of security officers, including James Morrison, remained in place, their expressions troubled, but their positions clear. 10, Camilla announced. In that moment, as the full force of the establishment prepared to descend upon them, Thomas knelt down one more time and gathered all 3 corgis in his arms. Candy, Sandy, and Muick pressed close to him, their warm bodies trembling with fear and confusion. "It's okay," he whispered to them. "Whatever happens, I won't let you face it alone." The battle lines had been drawn, and Thomas Harrison, a simple guardsman who had never imagined himself at the center of a constitutional crisis, prepared to face the consequences of choosing love over law, loyalty over career, and the memory of a beloved queen over the commands of her successor. The silence that followed Camilla's ultimatum was deafening. Thomas Harrison knelt in the marble hallway of Windsor Castle, surrounded by 3 trembling corgis, while the weight of history pressed down upon them all. The staff members who had chosen to remain formed a protective circle around him, their faces etched with determination despite the fear in their eyes. Just as the security team began to move forward, an unexpected voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. "What exactly is happening here?" Everyone turned to see King Charles III walking briskly down the corridor, his expression grave and concerned. Behind him walked Prince William, whose face showed both confusion and growing alarm at the scene before them. Thomas felt his heart skip a beat. Throughout his years of service, he had always admired King Charles, knowing him to be a man of deep compassion and understanding. But would that compassion extend to a guardsman who had openly defied the queen? Camilla immediately moved toward her husband, her composure returning as she prepared to present her version of events. "Charles, we have a situation with some insubordinate staff members. I was handling it." But King Charles raised his hand, his eyes taking in the extraordinary scene before him. Palace staff didn't gather in hallways, security didn't look uncomfortable with their orders, and guards certainly didn't kneel on marble floors holding animals unless something very significant was happening. "Thomas," the king said, addressing the guardsman directly, "please explain what's occurring here." Thomas slowly rose to his feet, still holding candy while the other two corgis pressed against his legs. His military training kicked in, and he stood at attention despite the irregular circumstances. "Your Majesty, Queen Camilla has ordered that the late Queen's corgis be removed to a boarding facility. I have respectfully refused to comply with this order, as it conflicts with the personal wishes Her late Majesty expressed to me during her final weeks." Prince William stepped forward, his expression growing darker as he processed the information. "The corgis are being sent away?" "Yes, sir," Mrs. Davies spoke up, her voice trembling but clear. "Against the late Queen's specific wishes that they remain at the palace." King Charles looked at his wife, and for a moment, the hallway fell completely silent. Everyone present understood they were witnessing a private moment between husband and wife playing out in public with enormous consequences for everyone involved. "Camilla," the king said quietly, "is this true?" "Charles, the palace cannot continue to function as an animal sanctuary," Camilla replied, her voice defensive. "We have important work to do. And these distractions must be eliminated." "Distractions?" Prince William's voice carried a note of disbelief. "These were my grandmother's most cherished companions. They brought her joy every single day for over a decade." Thomas watched the royal family dynamics play out, realizing that the conflict ran deeper than just the fate of 3 dogs. This was about the future direction of the monarchy, about whether tradition and sentiment would be swept away in favor of cold efficiency. King Charles walked slowly toward Thomas and the corgis. When he reached them, he knelt down, and candy immediately nuzzled against his hand with recognition. The king's eyes filled with emotion as he gently stroked the dog's golden fur. "I remember when Mother got candy," he said softly. "It was just after Father died. She was so alone. And this little creature brought light back into her eyes." The personal moment seemed to break something open in the hallway. Staff members who had been holding back tears finally let them flow freely. Here was the new king, kneeling on a marble floor, remembering his mother's grief and the comfort her beloved pets had provided. "Your Majesty," Thomas said carefully, "Her late Majesty asked me to promise that the corgis would be cared for. She was worried about what would happen to them after she was gone." King Charles looked up at Thomas, and in his eyes was both gratitude and deep sadness. "She spoke to me about them as well. She said they would need people who understood how much they meant to her." Camilla's face grew increasingly tense as she watched her husband's reaction. "Charles, we cannot make decisions based on emotional attachments. The monarchy must modernize." "Must it modernize by abandoning compassion?" Prince William asked, his voice sharp. "By forgetting what made my grandmother beloved by millions of people around the world?" The confrontation between family members was painful to witness, but Thomas realized that this moment would determine not just the fate of 3 dogs, but the character of the new reign. Would it be marked by compassion or coldness, continuity or complete change? King Charles stood up, his decision clearly forming. "The corgis will remain at the palace," he announced. "They will be cared for by staff members who love them and who understand their significance." "Charles?" Camilla's voice rose in protest. You cannot make this decision without consulting me. I am the king, Charles replied, his voice carrying quiet authority. And more importantly, I am a son who loved his mother and respected her wishes. The relief that swept through the gathered staff was almost tangible. Mrs. Davies openly wept, Sarah dropped to her knees to embrace Mook, and even the security officers allowed small smiles to cross their faces. But Thomas knew that his own situation remained precarious. He had still defied direct orders from the Queen, and there would be consequences to face. Your Majesty, he said, addressing King Charles, I accept full responsibility for my actions today. I understand that disciplinary measures may be necessary. King Charles studied the guardsman for a long moment. Thomas, you've served this family with distinction for 15 years. Today, you served with honor, even when it was difficult and dangerous to do so. That's not something that deserves punishment. It deserves recognition. The unexpected praise left Thomas speechless. Around him, the staff members began to disperse, their relief evident as the crisis passed. But the tension between the king and queen remained palpable. However, King Charles continued, I understand that this situation has created an impossible working relationship. Thomas, I'm offering you a choice. You can remain in your current position, with my full support, or you can accept a new role. What kind of new role, Your Majesty? I'm creating a new position, Companion Animal Coordinator for the royal household. You would be responsible for the care and well-being of all animals at royal residences, ensuring they receive the love and attention they deserve. The salary would be equivalent to your current position, with additional resources for veterinary care and specialized training. Thomas felt his knees nearly buckle with relief and gratitude. Not only was he not being punished, but he was being given the opportunity to turn his act of defiance into a new career dedicated to animal welfare within the royal household. I would be honored to accept such a position, Your Majesty, he managed to say. Excellent, King Charles smiled. Consider it your reward for keeping a promise to my mother. Camilla stood frozen in the hallway, clearly struggling to process how completely her authority had been overruled. The staff members who had supported Thomas were now openly celebrating, their jobs secure and their consciences clear. Prince William approached Thomas and extended his hand. Thank you for standing up for them, he said simply. My grandmother would have been proud. As the royal family prepared to leave, King Charles turned back one more time. Thomas, there's one more thing. I want you to know that rooms will be prepared for the Corgis in the family quarters. They're not just palace animals, they're family members, and they should be treated as such. The words struck Thomas deeply. This was more than just a resolution to the immediate crisis. It was an affirmation of the values that had made Queen Elizabeth beloved. Compassion, loyalty, and love would not be swept away in the name of modernization. As the days that followed unfolded, the story of the guardsman who defied a queen to protect 3 corgis spread throughout Britain and around the world. Letters of support poured in from ordinary citizens who had been touched by the tale of loyalty and courage. Children drew pictures of Thomas with the corgis, and elderly people shared stories of their own beloved pets. Thomas settled into his new role with enthusiasm, creating enrichment programs for all the royal animals and establishing partnerships with animal welfare organizations. The corgis thrived under his care, slowly recovering from their grief and beginning to show glimpses of their old playful spirits. Candy, the eldest, seemed to sense that she was finally safe. She would often be found napping in patches of sunlight, just as she had done with Queen Elizabeth. Sandy and Muke discovered joy again in their daily walks through the castle grounds, their tails wagging as they explored familiar paths. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came several weeks later, when Thomas was walking through the Queen's former private chambers, now maintained as a memorial. He found King Charles sitting in his mother's favorite chair, with all 3 corgis sleeping peacefully around his feet. "They're healing," the king said softly without looking up, "and so are we." Thomas realized then that his act of defiance had done more than save 3 dogs. It had helped preserve the soul of the monarchy itself. In standing up for the values of loyalty, compassion, and love, he had reminded everyone what truly mattered. The corgis were no longer just animals in the palace. They were living symbols of continuity, reminders that some bonds transcend death, and proof that sometimes the most important battles are fought not for kingdoms or crowns, but for the simple right of innocent creatures to be loved and protected. As Thomas watched the peaceful scene, he knew that somewhere in the great beyond, Queen Elizabeth II was smiling, knowing that her beloved companions were safe, cherished, and home where they belonged. Her faithful guard had kept his promise, and in doing so had helped ensure that the values she held dear would live on in the hearts of all who served the crown.